Hi, my name is James. Welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today we're going to tackle part 3 of how to build our shed series, and we're going to work on building the roof. These instructions will actually help you design and build a roof for any shed or any small building. And this is the shed that we are building for this series. This is a 10 by 16 shed that actually has 9-foot sidewalls. So it's 9 feet on the sides on the inside and 12 foot in the center. And we have a 7-foot door. The purpose of this shed building series is to give you an exact step-by-step tutorial so that you can build any size shed that you want. I will be following the International Building Code regulations for the design and build of this shed, and just about every jurisdiction in the United States follows these codes. My purpose is to make this tutorial easy enough to follow, even for someone who has no building experience. And the project is designed so that it can be done with a minimum number of tools. All you really need is a circular saw, a drill, a hammer, and some basic hand tools, and you can accomplish this project. So we're going to start with the basics of roof design, and our shed happens to have a 10-foot wide span. So that's from the outside of one wall, and that's the grand total. The outside of one wall to the outside of the other wall is exactly 10 feet, and that's important. Now, the run is a distance that's considered exactly half of the span. It goes from the outside of the wall to the dead center, the midline of the building. So the triangle that's formed from the right side of our roof has this line here as the hypotenuse. Now, our desired slope that we have chosen is the rise over the run of 712. Now we know our run and we know our slope, which is 712, but we don't really know how high this rise is. So I'm going to show you how to calculate this. It's really simple. Just follow along here. The rise I'm going to designate as y. We're just going to put this in some basic mathematical terms. So as I said earlier, our slope is 7 over 12. Now that's equal to what I said earlier, which is the rise over the run. Our rise we've designated as y in order to do our math with it here. And of course our run we know is 60 inches. I'm just going to keep everything in inches. That way it's going to give me my rise in inches when we're all done. Now when we have two fractions that are equal to each other, we can do a mathematical operation called cross multiply. So the 12 times the y is exactly equal to the 7 times the 60. I'm going to keep these color-coded and give you a snapshot of this formula later so you can use this to calculate any slope width. So 12 times y is simply 12y since that's unknown, and 7 times 60 is 420. In order to isolate the y, we can divide both sides of the equation by 12. Because 12 over 12 is just 1, so they cancel. And that leaves us with y, and 420 over 12 is 35. So therefore we can see that y, which is our rise, is equal to 35. So our rise is 35 inches high. And you can use this formula for any slope to calculate your rise. And if you want to grab a screenshot of that formula, you can do so here. So the next thing I'm going to have to figure out is how long that board is that makes up the hypotenuse. We know our run is 60, and we know our rise is 35. So the question becomes this, how long is it from here to here? I'm going to indicate that in green to show the exact line that I'm talking about. It's the line from the very peak to the very edge of the building. That's the hypotenuse. So to calculate this, we'll just use the Pythagorean theorem. And we can do that because this is a right angle, which means it's at 90 degrees. Now the Pythagorean theorem tells us that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So what does that mean? What that means is we're going to designate each of these legs or sides of a triangle with a letter. We'll say this side is A, the rise, and we'll call this side B. And those could be flip-flopped. What does matter is that the hypotenuse in this formula is C. That's what's important. So we'll take A, which we know is 35, and we have to square it. So we're going to take 35, and we're going to square that, and we're going to add that to B. And we know B is 60 inches. So we're going to take 60 inches and we're going to square it, and that of course is going to be equal to C squared, which is our hypotenuse. So we'll run the math, and 35 squared, which is 35 times 35, is 1225. And 60 squared, which is 60 times 60, is 3600. And those two things added up equal C squared. Then we'll add them up. Those two guys combined is 4825, and that equals C squared. Now, C squared doesn't do us any good. We got to know C. And one mathematical operation we can do is to take the square root of both sides of an equation, and we know the equation's still valid. So we'll take the square root of 4825, which is 69.5, and that gives us the square root of C squared, which is C. And there you have it. We now know the length of C, the hypotenuse. That's 69.5 inches. And this works for any right triangle. That's distance from this corner to this corner. Now, it doesn't include any overhang over here, but I'm going to show you how to add that on. I'll put up a snapshot of this math and formula also if you want to get a screenshot of that for future use. Okay, so to recap, we have the 69.5 inches, which we calculated to be the hypotenuse, and of course it does not include any overhang. So I'm going to show you how to calculate that, and we'll talk about that briefly, but I'm going to go to another sheet of paper here so it's not so cluttered with all those calculations. And this would be a rafter, and you can see it's got some overhang. Now, the distance that it comes horizontally off of the wall of the shed is called the projection. But before we deal with that, we have to talk about this notch that's going to go in the rafter to allow it to sit down on top of the building. There's a couple of names for that, and I'm going to zoom in close to show what we're talking about here. Some people call it a bird's mouth, some call it the seat cut that goes on the rafter. And I've made a loose rafter here to show you what happens. So with one side staying flush with the midline and the other side, I'm going to mark a little point here on the edge of the wall, I'm going to show you no matter how deep we make that cut, basically the midline stays where it's at and the point on the side of the wall stays where it's at. Those don't change. You can see as we move this up and down here, those 2 points will stay in the same orientation. So the distance is always the same. Our hypotenuse always remains the same. Some people get the feeling once you talk about bird's mouths, it's going to change the angle of the cut or make things complicated, and it really doesn't. It all stays the same. So we'll put this in a place where we think we might want it, and we're going to just trace that bird's mouth cut in right here. And that's what we would typically notch out of a rafter in order to get a nice flat surface for the rafter to rest on, a place for us to screw or nail the rafter into the top of the wall so it can't move around. Kind of gives your building some extra strength. I'm going to cut that out here, just sort of to make a little model here and show you how this works. And you can see easily how that fits right over the top of the roof like that. And like I said, we call this the bird's mouth. And it's also referred to sometimes as a seat cut, but I grew up learning that it was a bird's mouth. Now we have to deal with this overhang. The distance that it comes horizontally along this line is called the overhang. And we're going to get about 6 inches. We don't really care about specifics because it's a shed. Now, if we were building a home and we would need to know very specific distances, the distance that it comes directly off or the furthest most reach out from the edge of the building is called the projection. And the projection would be at a right angle to the building. And we could use the same formulas, the ABC, the Pythagorean theorem, and we could do all sorts of calculations, but it really doesn't matter. For a shed, we want about 6 inches. So it makes math easy for a shed. We just need to remember from this point to this point, and not including our overhang, which is about 6 inches, those 2 points, if we look back at our original sketch, is about 69.5 inches. And we got that from our calculations. So from there to there is 69.5 inches. And now we know we want to add about 6 inches to the end. So when we add those up, we're going to get about 75.5 inches. And that's going to be our total rafter length. And now we'll take a look at the bird's mouth itself. It has also a rise and a run, much like the roof pitch does. And our rise we're going to put here about 1.25 inches. We could come as much as 1.5 inches, but 1.25 inches is a good distance. And we'll just keep that in mind when we trace this out on a rafter. This is a right angle here, so that'll help us to do the layout on the rafter. And here's a quick screenshot of some of those measurements so that you can grab these if you would like to and put those in your record so when you go to calculate your own roof. One more final thing I wanted to show you is the difference between slope and pitch. A lot of modern roofers use these interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. They're different things. If we look at the building, the total width of the building is called the span. That's from one edge to the other. And the rise is, of course, here, how high it goes, and the run is exactly half of the span. And for us to calculate slope, which is what we all use today, that's rise over run, which is the rise over the run, simple math formula, if you remember from math class, y equals mx plus b, and slope is always expressed in something over 12. Whereas pitch, on the other hand, doesn't use the run. It uses the rise over the span, the total width. And that's the pitch. And that's always expressed in the smallest fraction. It's not expressed in some number over 12. That's important. I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a building that's 24 feet wide. That's from one edge of the building to the other. And that would give it a run of 12 feet because the run is half of the span. And let's say our building has, say, a 4-foot rise, for example. So we can calculate the slope very easily. The slope is the rise over the run. We'll color code this here too, and we'll take a snapshot at the end for you, which would be 4 over 12. And that's it. That's the answer. You're all done. That's the slope. The slope is the rise over the run, which is 412. This roof has a 412 slope. Not a 412 pitch. That's a different thing. To calculate the pitch, it's going to be, as we said in the equation down below, it's going to be the rise over the span. The rise is the same 4 feet, but the span is different. The span, of course, is the whole thing, which is 24 feet. And 4 over 24 will reduce down to 1/6. We always indicate pitch in the lowest possible fraction. So the pitch is 1/6. So 1/6 and 4/12, those are two different numbers. And today it's common to use the slope. In fact, it's the most common method that we use, and we don't really use the word pitch anymore. Although a lot of roofers do, it is technically a different thing. And if you were to go to a building department, you would need to give them your roofing data in slope, not pitch. The slope doesn't equal the pitch. Anyway, that's just a piece of historical information for you. I thought that was interesting, and I thought I would point that out. With the math finally out of the way, let's use that data to build our roof. We will, of course, be using a speed square for our rafter square to make these sloped cuts. And if we look at the common cuts here, these numbers will represent the various slopes that we have. And ours, of course, is a 712 slope. Now, if you want to build a shed and you don't want to do any of this math, we do have plans for sale for most common shed sizes, and all the math has been done for you, all the dimensions, angles, everything, and you can just build it. And there's a link to those plans in the description below. First we'll make the ridge cut, which is the angled cut, the 7/12 slope cut, by rotating this over to 7 and drawing a line there. This is the top part of the rafter. And then we're going to take a careful measurement from there down to the beginning of the bird's mouth, and we'll mark that. We'll just take the number off of our sketch, we'll make a mark, and then we're going to add some distance for our overhang, which was about 6 inches, and we'll take a mark there. Both of these lines will also be at our 7/12 slope, so we'll put the pivot point of our square right there on that line, and we'll pivot it over till we reach the 7. That gives us a 7/12 slope. Make sure 7 is lined up right at the edge of the rafter, and we'll draw that line. That's for the bird's mouth. And you'll notice that there is a ruler on the edge of the speed square, so we're going to need to make a mark up at about 1.25 like we said. We'll hook it on the edge of the rafter, go up 1.25 and make our mark. And if you recall, the bird's mouth of course is square, so we can use any sort of a square here to complete the sketch of the bird's mouth. That's it. Now the line above here of course doesn't mean anything, and this is the area we're going to be removing for our bird's mouth cut. Finally, to terminate the rafter, that's 6 inches further over, is going to be the very end of it. We're going to do the same thing, put our pivot point on that mark, and we're going to rotate the pivot over till we get to 7/12 again, because everything's at that same 7/12 slope. And we'll draw our line, and that's going to mark the very edge of the rafter. That's how we complete the layout of the rafter itself. Typically we just have to complete the layout once, and we'll use that piece as a template. So we'll grab the circular saw and we'll proceed to cut out all of these lines. In the interest of speed, some builders will overcut these bird's mouths so that they can simply cut them off with a circular saw all by itself. I myself never do that. I prefer to leave the structural integrity of the rafter there as much as possible. So I'll come back and follow up and cut those off with the jigsaw so I don't have any overcutting done. But since I had the circular saw in my hand, I went ahead and cut the other end off first, and now I'll jump back over here with the jigsaw and I'll cut these off so that there's no overcut. This kind of gives the maximum strength that we can get, or we can give to this particular rafter. So this is what it looks like all complete. This is one rafter, and all rafters are identical, the left, the right, and everyone on down the row. So I typically take one that came out nice and perfect, the first one, hopefully, and we'll mark template on it, and we'll use that to trace everything else. And that's it. We'll just lay these over the tops of the others. We'll trace them out and take them over to the deck. So the next thing we want to do is to create a gusset. I know in the previous video we did go ahead and film the building of the walls, but the creation of these trusses was actually done first. And the trusses are made, I use a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, and I get about as big of a piece as I can out of it here. I lay the rafters in the exact position that they're going to go, making sure the angle is perfect, and then I will trace them out on there, and we'll go ahead and cut this piece out, and this is going to be a gusset. This is what's going to give those rafters a connection with one another and create a truss. The truss is the structural unit that, of course, is how we build the roof. And we'll take that particular gusset and we'll use that to trace as many more as we can. Now, on our particular roof, it took about 1 1/4 sheets of plywood, I think, to get all of the individual gussets out that we needed in order to create this. So my daughter Sai is going to trace all of these out, and she's going to kind of try to create a geometrical pattern to get as many pieces as she can out of this one piece of plywood. Once that's done, we will cut them out. And that's exactly what Maya did. So while Maya's doing this, I wanted to take a quick second to ask you, if you guys watch our videos and you like what you see, if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and like this video, that would really mean a lot to us. That's really the only way our channel can grow, is by folks hitting that subscribe button, and we really appreciate it if you could do that for us. Thank you. So while my daughter Maya is going to finish cutting out the gussets, my other daughter Sai here is going to take the rafter template and trace the remainder of the rafters. And then Maya will cut out the remainder of the rafters for us. If any of you are ever on Facebook, you might check out our King's Find Woodworking community. It's a community, a private community actually, for woodworkers, and we have about 20,000 members in there so far, and it's just a great place to share your work or get advice on projects that you're working on. There's people in there with every experience level, from beginner all the way up to expert. I spend about 100 hours a month myself in the community answering questions. I also post links to deals that are coming up. I write articles for the group, and it's kind of a fun place to be if you're into that sort of thing. So you might give that a look, and there's a link to that in the description below. With the individual rafters and the gussets all cut out, it is time to build the trusses. The first thing we're going to do is to screw a board on the end here, and this is kind of a mock-up of the siding, which would be on the outside of the building. Now this mock-up is about a 1/2 inch wide, and my siding is 3/8, so this gives us just a little bit of play in the trusses should I make an error or something, so the truss could slide back and forth on the top a little bit if necessary. So we'll go ahead and install one of these on each side of the deck portion of the shed here with screws, and we will build the trusses around this. Now this is the main reason we didn't put the walls up yet. We wanted to have the open deck space available in order to build the trusses on. It just helps get a super accurate truss. We're going to create a pattern here in order to duplicate all of these trusses and make them identical. So we have them in place. They're coming right out to the very edge of our mock-up piece of siding on both sides, and our angle does meet perfectly in the middle. If it doesn't, you might need to check your measurements and fix that. Then we'll take a gusset, we'll place that on top. Now I don't necessarily want the gusset to go right up to the top of those 2x4 rafters. I want it to go down just a little bit, so maybe to the top of the curve. And we will just nail this in. I typically like to put a nail at each corner, each outside corner first, then one into each rafter at the top on both sides, and then about 3 going down the midline on each side. And this makes for a really strong truss. Now a truss, of course, is a structure that is made up of the rafter pieces themselves and the gusset in this case. Now with that complete, we will take a look at it. We'll rotate it up into position as if it were in place on the building. And it looks pretty good. You can see we have the ability to slide back and forth. Of course, there's no siding in there yet, but that's the concept. So we'll go ahead and place this back down into place. And we're going to take some short pieces of 2x4, and we're going to nail these into the deck itself. In essence, we are creating a form so that we can put the other rafters into place, and that each rafter is going to be in the exact location as the one that came before, so that ultimately all of our rafters, or all of our trusses I should say, are exactly the same. And that's critical. You want a nice smooth, perfect roof line, then you want all of your trusses to be exactly the same. So we've nailed this into the decking, and it's no problem to just pull these things out later when we're done assembling our trusses. With that one done, we'll pull this first truss out, and we're going to lay it upside down, and we're going to put the gusset on the other side. We'll just try to line it up so that it's in the same rough orientation as the gusset below it. And you can see I don't have the gusset coming all the way up to the very top of the rafter. That way it doesn't interfere. We don't make a mistake of putting it too high and altering our roof line. It's also important to note at this point that not all of the trusses are going to get a gusset on both sides. The truss that occurs on the end of each building only gets a gusset on the inside of the building, not the outside. We want the siding to go all the way up to the top on the outside. So all of the middle trusses get a gusset on both sides, but the two end trusses, the gable end trusses, one on either end, they only get a gusset on the inside. Once again, with that done, we'll flip it over and put the gusset on the other side of this one. And by putting two gussets, of course, this signifies that this is an interior truss. Once the trusses are complete, we'll move those off of the deck here so that we can free up our deck and move on to the next phase of the build, which is the walls. And hopefully you've seen that video. If not, I'll put a link to that in the description below. And it looks like Lily is going to help us move these trusses out of the way. This is going to conclude the first half of the roof build. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you can come back to see the second half coming up soon. Thanks for watching.